The idea that we've introduced you to is that media policy is something that doesn't only organize media, but also organizes society. And in this video, what I'm going to be talking about is how that applies to alcohol advertising and its regulation. What we're going to learn is that advertising is itself a media form that creates certain sorts of social reality that have profound economic and social effects, and therefore the regulation of that advertising is operating on the same terrain. But we're also going to be thinking about why alcohol advertising is a particularly useful example to explore these ideas. And the reason for this is that if we look at the history of alcohol consumption in Europe, what we find is that drinking alcohol is actually a cultural activity that people have been discussing as something that relates to the basic nature of humanity, of human agency, and of the ways that humans themselves need to be managed in social life. Drinking itself is something which summarizes a lot of our hopes and fears about the nature of humans and choice and rational choice. And therefore, the way that we advertise alcohol and the way that we try and control that advertising connects with all of those very, very deep, important political issues as well. And let me just explain how that works. So you'll see on the left an 18th century picture called Gin Lane, which is a painting featuring the kind of drunken debauchery which polite society feared had become far too common in British culture in the late 18th century. In this period, Britain was challenged by a huge unlicensed gin trade that made highly powerful, that made very, very strong liquor widely available and cheaply available to a mass public. And you may have heard gin, which is a particular alcoholic drink, you may have heard it called Mother's Ruin. And we can see that particular moniker emerging from this picture. This is a picture by the English painter Hogarth, featuring most prominently, it's a scene of general drunken debauchery in the streets of London. But of course, front and center is an image of the bad drunken mother. We have a woman who is so drunk she can't even hold on to her own baby, and she's dropping that baby onto the floor. And this is because of her drunkenness. Now, if we move over to the image on the right, you see another drunken mother. But this is a highly normalized, even glamorized image of the drunken mother, of drunkenness. So what do we have here? Well, this is a picture that was taken to promote a particular kind of alcoholic a beverage called tonic wine, which was basically a very high percentage alcoholic drink. Most of these tonic wines are around 15% ABV, which is stronger than the bottles of wine that you would buy in the supermarket today. And two things differentiated these wines from the sorts of wines that you might buy today. Firstly, they were stronger. And secondly, they had loads of vitamins thrown into them as well. So they were actually sold as health drinks, and this particular image, trying to sell tonic wine to women who worked in the home, is pretty funny. But the thing that we've got to remember is it made absolute sense at the time, and it represents a time when it was actually possible to argue that getting drunk was a legitimate solution to your problems. The logic of this ad defies explanation from a contemporary point of view. You could never have an ad like this today. And what the ad says is that Basically, if you read the copy, what it says is that for the women who worked in the home in the 1960s, or up until the age of about 1970. I'm kind of guessing on the age based on the kind of the setup and the haircuts and the clothes. We can kind of take this as being kind of around 1970. And the story runs that this poor woman is run ragged by her kids at home. Of course, there's a contemporary relevance to it. And, I think a lot of people who've been through homeschooling in 2020 would be able to relate. But this idea that mother's feeling bad because she's constantly scolding and running after her children, but she can't help but being irritated because they're just always there, being noisy and causing problems all the time. And the solution is to have a couple of glasses of wine. Things just go better when when you've had a few glasses of wine. And this is actually there was a whole series of these commercials which sold Sanatogen tonic wine to women who worked on the home, on the same kind of lines. There's another one that I particularly like that talks about Sanatogen wine as a way of overcoming loneliness and social isolation, that women who worked in the home were stuck at home either by themselves or with their children, robbed of adult company whilst their husbands went off to work. It kind of assumes a patriarchal society, and a way to get through that would be just to have a few glasses of wine. The day kind of goes better if you start having a few belts early in the morning and then just kind of maintain that throughout the day. Now, of course, we know that such an advertisement could never be possible today. The idea of being drunk making you a better mother is something that you couldn't say. But what we do begin to see here is the way that representations of alcohol, the advertising, for example, one of the things that it works to do is normalize drinking by setting alcohol in a particular setting. And this is really the key to understanding alcohol advertising. How does alcohol advertising normalize drinking? Through setting alcoholic consumption in particular contexts. So we might look at both of these images and say, well, they're the same thing, right? They're both about mothers with young children. But one's a bad mother and the other is a good mother. And what we see is that we have, the idea that consuming booze is the way to solve your problems of motherhood. But we've taken something which is, I guess it's moved from being an abhorrent idea to a normal idea and then back to being an abhorrent idea again. But we can see that through advertising, we were presented in the 1970s with the idea that this is quite normal. There's nothing wrong with this, except there's a difference, isn't there? What we see in the woman on the right is that we have quite a different class image. The drunken mother on the left is sitting out on the streets where she shouldn't be with her child, I guess, because there's drunken people all over the place. Whereas what we see in the image to the right is the image of the slightly drunk mother at home. So she's drinking in a less risky way. She's drinking for the good of other people, but she's surrounded by the comforts of consumer society. And this is what we see, that the drinking isn't just about drinking. It's about managing life in an affluent consumer society where drinking is actually part of the lifestyle. So we're seeing quite a very different point of view from the sort of image that Hogarth was painting in 1790. Now, what makes this shift possible? Well, the thing that makes it possible was summarized, I guess, most famously in the book Social Communication and Advertising by Leiss, Klein and Jarley. And what Leiss, Klein and Jarley did, and there's been several editions of this book, I guess beginning from the late 1970s, is that they talk about the history of advertising as one that marks the shift from what they called informational to what they called transformational advertising. And the argument is that advertising begins from the growth of consumer of discretionary consumer spending and the multiplication of goods available to buy in the 19th century. And originally advertising was there to explain to classes of people who had, for the first time, had a bit of spare money in their pocket, why they should spend money on objects that it wasn't immediately apparent why they needed them. Okay, so if you think about, for example, think about iPads. When iPads first came out, it wasn't immediately apparent why everybody would need a really, really big iPhone that you couldn't get in your pocket. But gradually we were told why we needed them. And so what Lice, Klein, and Jarley talked about was the way that advertising begins with this informational task, telling people why they need products. But then very soon it shifts because what you have is a wide range of products that do the same job. And so you can't simply sell a product by focusing on its functional aspects. You also need to talk about how a product fits within a certain kind of desirable lifestyle. And this is what Lice, Klein, and Jarley meant by transformational advertising. They talked about the way that advertising began to talk not about goods and what they would do, and began to talk about desirable lifestyles, the sorts of lifestyles that people wanted to live. And I suppose kind of one of the things is we look at the most recent edition of their book. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because it's an image that's taken from somewhere in Asia. I'm not sure where, but what we see, of course, is this disparity between advertising practice and the real life of ordinary people. We have an advert that's about getting the latest mobile phone, juxtaposed against the image of a person who, is making a living by through very, very difficult manual labor, and doesn't really have the luxury of time that one would imagine drives consumer society. But nevertheless, the idea is that Lice, Klein, and Jarley introduced is that advertising works transformationally by kind of dissolving the product itself into an overall image of a desirable lifestyle, which is what we see in the Synaptogen wine and advertisement. But the other important thing to note is that this is one of the things that makes advertising regulation difficult to police, and that's that according to Lice, Klein, and Jarley, it's actually now very rare to find advertising that makes direct claims about the value of a specific product. That's not really what advertising is dealing with. Advertising is really more dealing in dreams of perfect lifestyles where products may or may not be consistent with those lifestyles. And it's that idea that encapsulates why alcohol advertising in particular is so difficult to regulate. And this in turn sensitizes us to some of the principles at stake in the formation of effective media policy.